Hello dear students, my name is Rانيا السباعي and I will be with you in this course, the theory of international relations. We were supposed to meet last Tuesday to start our first lecture. However, unluckily because of the precautionary measures taken by Cairo University, we will be having our lectures these 2 weeks through the PowerPoint presentation and the recorded audio. Hopefully things will be better soon and we will be back to our classroom inshallah. Today we will be speaking about our first topic, which is very important topic, which is international conflict. First we would ask ourselves a question: what do we mean by conflict? What do we mean by international conflict? In general, the term conflict, it refers to this dispute, this discord, this disagreement, this incompatibility of interest between the states. The situation where states have differences in how to achieve their interest. The case where if state A wants to achieve its interest, it cannot do this except at the expense of the other state. And conflict can have different reasons. They can be over territory, they can be territorial disputes, they can be over certain economic resources, they can be over certain political reasons, they could have, of course, religious or cultural or ethnic reasons. So again, international conflict in general, it's about this disagreement, this dispute between states over how to achieve their interest. The other question that we need to ask ourselves: do always international conflict lead to military conflict, lead to war? The answer is no. Sometimes military conflict can, international conflict can, yes, lead to military confrontation and war. Other times international conflict can simply go on as it is without erupting, without moving into a military confrontation. And the third case, sometimes actually this conflict can be settled. So in many cases we can find that the conflict can come to a solution. The conflicting countries, in a way or another, through negotiations or other means, can come to an end to this conflict. If sometimes international conflict leads to military confrontation or lead to war, does this mean that all types of military confrontation are the same? They all are just named or labeled by war and that's it? Actually, theorists distinguish between different types of war. Of course, in real life, it's that difficult to draw clear lines between the different types of war, but theoretically, at least, scholars try to distinguish to us between the different types of war. So we will be speaking quickly about 5 types of war: the hegemonic war, the total war, the limited war, civil war, and guerrilla war. The first type, and the more general type, is this hegemonic war, this comprehensive war, general, world, global war. And from its name you can imagine that this type of war is mainly between the big superpowers over controlling the international system. The most prominent examples of this war, of course, are the World War I and World War II. And here, the hegemonic war, as it comes from its name, it's mainly, it involves a big number of countries. It's mainly about who controls the international system, who rules the international system. Then comes other 2 types of war, which are the total war and the limited war. The total war, it's about this case when one country wages a war against another country with the aim of total occupation, total control, fully conquering the other country with the aim of the full control of its own territory and its political regime. And the examples here, for example, can be the colonization wars, the British and the French and the Italian colonization of many of the third world countries over the last 2 centuries. Here we have a country that aims at fully controlling, conquering other state, putting its land, its territory, its political regime totally under its control. The recent examples that we can that we can think of, about total war are like the U.S. invasion of Iraq or of Afghanistan in 2003 and 2001. Here the U.S. troops, it entered the country, it totally controlled nearly controlled all the territory of the country. It was able to get rid of the ruling political regime and installed a new political regime. To the contrary, limited war does not have this general or this big aim. As it comes from its name, limited war is more about using military force to a certain extent, to a limited extent, to achieve a certain goal. So, for example, the air raids that one country can wage against its adversary. For example, the British and the American air raids which they have made against Iraq during Saddam Hussein regime in the 1990s. Here they did not enter the Iraqi regime. They did not control the Iraqi territory. They did not invade the Iraqi territory. They just employed limited military operations in order to achieve certain goals, in order to urge the Iraqi regime at that time to accept certain agreements. So the total war here, as it comes from its name, its aim is total, full occupation, full control. While the limited war, it has less aims, it has more limited aims, using or deploying limited military operation to achieve certain goals. The fourth type is the civil war. The civil war is this type of intrastate war, internal war, where some factions or groups inside one state, they fight against each other for certain reasons. For example, this can be for ethnic or religious reasons. For example, like the many of civil wars that happened in Africa after the independence of many of the African countries. However, they fell into a series of civil wars because of the ethnic differences and confrontations that happened in these countries. For example, like the Lebanese civil war in the 1970s and so on. So the civil war, الحرب الأهلية, this type of war which involves internally the factions and the groups inside one state. Okay, now if we are speaking about the civil war, about internal war, then why is it important to tackle it in studying international conflict? The answer is that most civil wars have international repercussions and aspects. Most cases of civil wars, they have called the intervention of external actors, whether they are neighboring countries, whether they are international or regional organizations, regional powers, superpowers. At the end of the day, most civil wars, they end to have this external, this international dimension. Look, for example, at the Syrian conflict, the Yemeni conflict, the Libyan conflict. You can find that at the beginning it seems to be an internal conflict between the different groups inside this country, different groups who have different aims or goals to achieve. However, you will find that for example, on the Syrian battlefield, you will find the competition and tension between different regional and international powers. You will find the group led by the US and Turkey and some of the Gulf countries supporting the opposition parties, while on the other hand we have mainly Russia and Iran supporting the political regime. So again, civil wars, although it starts as an internal type of conflict, however, in most cases it has its external dimension. Usually regional and superpowers, they tend tend to intervene in these civil wars for different reasons to achieve their own interest. The last type that we will be speaking about is the guerrilla war. And this type of war is different because it does not involve only the regular or the conventional armies. It's not only about confrontation between different armies of different countries. The guerrilla war, one of its major aspects is that it's a confrontation between conventional or regular armies, القوات المسلحة العادية، الجيوش العادية, and on the other hand we have irregular forces, militias, armed groups. What matters is that they do not present a unified national army. They are more or less irregular forces that can be weaponized or militarized, but they do not present an army of another state. And they are usually related to the liberation movements. The case, for example, when one state is exposed to invasion or occupation, like for example during the colonization era, we have many liberation movements who tried to use force in order to expel these invaders out of their land. Or for example the Vietnamese national groups who tried to expel the American troops when they entered Vietnam in the late 60s. The idea here is that it's a confrontation between a regular army and irregular forces who depend on the tactic of hit and run. They depend on the idea, they know that they do not have enough weapons, they are not highly equipped like a regular army. They depend on the tactics of causing harm to this regular army. They depend on tactics that aim at increasing the cost for this regular army to stay in this country. The most popular examples, as I said, are related to the liberation movements. The irregular forces that try to use tactics of hit and run, that they try to cause harm to the armies that are on their land. They know that they cannot fight them as regular armies, so they depend on irregular, on non-conventional, non-traditional forms of fight. The aim is to cause the biggest, the most possible harm to this national army to make it more expensive for them to stay in this country. The examples, of course, are like the liberation movements during the colonization era, and for example, like the Vietnamese groups trying to expel the American troops during the Vietnam War. What about the pattern, the trend of military conflict all over the world? We will give a quick snapshot over the general trend of international conflict. In general, scholars have made to us some general observations about the trend of armed conflict. The first observation, they told us that since the 1950s, since the end of the Second World War, our world had witnessed a lower number of military conflicts, a lower number of wars. However, they noticed that wars have become more deadly. The injuries, the destructiveness, the losses that occur because of these wars have become more deadly, have become higher. So number one, although the number of wars have declined in general, however, they have become more deadly, they have become more costly, more dangerous, causing more harm or loss. The second observation they have noticed is that there had been an increase in the number of conflicts or confrontations where the irregular groups, irregular forces are participating or are partners or are parties in this conflict. So again, the observations that the scholars have made, general observations about the trend of international conflict, they have noticed that we are witnessing, yes, a lower number of wars, but they actually are more deadly, are more dangerous. Number two, that actually wars are no longer between regular armies, conventional armies. The number of conflicts where we have irregular forces, irregular armed forces, are on increase. The third point is about the increased number of civil wars, and not only the increase in the number of civil wars, but what matters for us is the increased international aspect of these civil wars. As we explained before, that most civil wars, although they start as internal matters, however they gain an international dimension because of the intervention of the different international actors. So an important observation that scholars have noticed, that since the end of the Cold War, most wars, most conflicts have been related to civil wars. However, there had been an increased internationalization of these civil wars. The other observation also that they have noticed, that over the last 50 or 60 years since the end of the Second World War, actually more wars and conflicts are concentrated in the global south among the developing countries. That while the developed world has moved to become a more peaceful zone, actually the developing south has moved to more conflict and confrontations. And related to this, they believe, as we said when we explained the hegemonic war, that the idea of having a hegemonic war or a world war, a war between the major superpowers, are no longer valid. Most probably it will not happen. It did not happen since the end of the Second War, and most probably it may not happen. And as we said, many justifications are given for this observation, and one of the major justification is related to the idea of nuclear deterrence. These countries, they own, each one of them, the nuclear weapon. And in a very simple way, nuclear deterrence means that each one of them knows that if it uses the nuclear weapon against the other can retaliate, تقدر ترد, and actually if this happened, the whole world will come to an end. So overall, this is a quick snapshot. I'm not expecting you to memorize it. I'm just asking you to understand it and to think. These are major or general observations about the general trend of international conflict. That the world, while it had become, it had witnessed less or lower number of wars, however, these wars have gained a more deadly aspect. While the world had witnessed more trend of civil wars, they have also gained a more internationalized aspect. That most of the wars and the conflicts, unluckily, are located or concentrated in the global south. Now we will be moving to our big and major question, which is, why do countries go to war? And as we said, we will be employing the 3 levels of analysis to have a more detailed and a more focused view on why countries go to war. We will start with the individual level of analysis. The first level, as we said, is the individual level of analysis. And in this level, we will be distinguishing between 2 main levels or 2 main trends. The first trend or the first direction, it focuses on the link between war and aggression on one hand and human nature. While the second trend, it focuses more on the leaders, the individual leaders, the psychological, the personal traits and characteristics of these leaders and how it affects their choices and their decisions of war. So to simplify things, when we tackle the individual level of analysis, we'll be speaking about 2 dimensions. The first dimension is related to the main statements that tried to examine, is there a link between the human nature and going to war or not? And the second dimension is about examining the personal and psychological traits characteristics of leaders and how this affect their decision. How can this help us to understand even partially the decision to go to war? The first dimension, which is related to the link between war and human nature, was actually tackled by a group of scholars, including psychologists, for example, like Freud, was also tackled by ethologists, and ethologists are those scientists who are caring about studying animals' behavior. And also this trend includes the realist theory, and also the Darwinist theory. What did this dimension say about the link between human nature and war? They have agreed that, according to them, of course we can accept this or not, but we have to understand first their argument. According to this group, which included some psychologists, the ethologists, the realist scholars, as well as the Darwinist from the field of biology, this group believed that we go to war and aggression by nature. It's related to our human nature. They have this pessimistic view. We have a bad, evil human nature, which actually encourages us, drives us to go to war and competition. So for them, they believe that war and aggression happens because of our human nature. We have nothing, we can do nothing to prevent it or to stop it. War is related to our bad human nature. Do you think that this is acceptable? Some would say yes and some would say no. And accordingly, some scholars believed in this argument, while other scholars, of course, mainly the liberals, if you remember when you studied the classical liberalism and institutional liberalism, liberals in general have a good view of the human nature. So for them, they rejected this pessimistic view of human nature. They rejected this link between war and human nature. And they questioned this assumption by telling them, yes, that if the human nature was that bad and always goes to war, what explains the cases of cooperation? What explains that countries and people in many times have cooperated? So this idea of cooperation, this event of cooperation nullifies, challenges your ideas, you psychologists and realists and Darwinists. So the liberals and the pacifists, they have rejected, challenged the ideas of the other scholars who believe that human nature is bad, and accordingly we go to war by our nature. For the liberals and the pacifists, they believe that this is not acceptable. We cannot relate, this is oversimplified. We cannot relate violence and war simply to our human nature, because our human nature is not bad. For the liberals, they believe that human nature is good and people can cooperate, and people actually do cooperate. The real world tells us that there are many incidents where countries have cooperated together. So it's not about the human nature. So the first dimension, explaining or trying to explain the why countries go to war, we have this dimension which focuses on the relation between the human nature, examining the human nature, and the decision to go to war. We have a group who believes that by nature we are bad, by nature we go to war and competition, while we have another group that rejects, nullifies, challenges this argument, because it simply tells us that if humans are that bad and they always go to war, how can you explain the cases, the many cases that we had witnessed when countries cooperate together, when people cooperate together? The incidences of cooperation nullifies, challenges your assumptions. Building on the first dimension, we are still tackling the first dimension, which tries to examine the relation between human nature and war. As we said, we have two groups. One group actually totally supporting that human nature is justifying, our bad human nature is justifying, is related to our decision to go to war, while the other group has rejected this. Within the same dimension, we have another trend which try to examine that if we will not be speaking about human nature in general, can we speak about certain communities, certain groups, certain nations that have certain traits making them more prone to war? Can we speak about certain communities, for example, Muslims, Hindus, Chinese, Asian, Americans, Europeans? Can we speak about certain communities who have certain traits, who are more prone to war, who are less peaceful compared to others? Can we speak about communities who are more peaceful than others? Actually, this argument was heavily criticized because the critics who rejected this idea, they said that this is oversimplification, this is cultural stereotyping, that you judge a certain group or a certain community by certain trait. That, for example, you say that all Muslims, they prefer violence or they go to war, or that all Hindus are violent. For this idea was totally rejected because it was believed that it's unfair, it's oversimplified, it's stereotyping to put a certain, as if you are putting a certain stamp over a certain community without any proper justification. So the idea of relating certain community, certain group, certain ethnicity to a war, or judging that it is more prone to war or more prone to peace, was also heavily criticized and was also heavily rejected. On the other hand, we have also another trend that tried to link between, to generalize, if I was able to study a certain leader, can I generalize the traits of this leader over his whole community or his whole state? So, for example, if I judged on Hitler's ideas, can I generalize over the whole German population? And again, this idea was totally rejected. The idea to generalize whether from the part to the whole or whether from the whole to the part was totally rejected. So to conclude, the first dimension, which was tackling the relation between human nature and war, it focused, number one, on a group of scholars that assume that bad human nature justifies or pushes humans to go to war. It's by nature that we go to war. As we said, this was rejected by the liberals and pacifists. And the second group of scholars who try to link or try to investigate, can we make a link between certain communities, certain groups, and the decision to go to war? Do we have some communities who are by nature more prone to war, who are by nature more prone to peace? And as we said, also this trend, this idea was heavily criticized, that this was overgeneralization, oversimplification, stereotyping that cannot be accepted. The third trend, it goes vice versa. Instead of generalizing from the general to the part, from the whole to the part, it takes vice versa. That can we generalize from the leaders to their people? So if, for example, I analyzed Putin or Merkel or Hitler, can I take their traits and generalize them over the whole population? And also this idea was heavily criticized because also this overgeneralization was falsified, was rejected. So this is the first dimension in the individual level of analysis, trying to examine the link between human nature and war. The second dimension that we will be tackling focuses more on the leaders, the personal traits, the psychological characteristics of the leaders and how it affects their decision to go to war. This dimension, as we said, it focuses on the leader's choices, on the personal attributes of the leaders and how it affects their decision to go to war, the personal characteristics of the leaders and how it affects their decision to go to wars. Because some leaders may be risk averse, some leaders may be risk takers, they may be confrontational, they may have this personality that tends to take risk. So they may be more prone, more courageous to take the decision to go to war, while other leaders may prefer to take more time before they make the decision. Or some leaders, their personality affect their way of decision making. So maybe their personality is more about trying to tackle or trying to use diplomatic means before resorting to war. Sometimes the background of the leader affects his decision. For example, there is a debate. If we have a leader who has a military background, does the military background make the leader more prone to go to war or not? And we have this debate. Some say yes, because he has this experience. He feels that he's experienced enough to lead his country to go to war, while other leaders, even if they have a military background, because they have experienced war, because they know that it is costly, it's difficult, it's expensive, they may be less prone to go to war because they know that war is not that easy. So again, this dimension, it focuses on the leaders' traits, attributes, and how it affects their decision making. So for example, if I'm studying the 1973 war, I will be focusing on the personal characteristics, attributes, the background of the main leaders, decision makers, for example, Sadat, for example, the main leaders in Israel, and how it affected their decision to go to war. The other point also regarding the leaders is the perception of the leaders, how the leaders perceive their countries and their enemies. How do I assess as a leader my power versus my enemy's power? Because this issue of perceptions is very important. As we said, leaders at the end of the day, they are humans. Yes, they take major decisions, but they are humans. So for example, when a leader wants to take a decision of the war, a major dimension that he focuses on is to assess his own powers, his country's powers versus his enemy's power. And this is very important, how he perceives his country's power, because sometimes misperception about my own power or about my enemy's power can lead to wrong decisions. And here we can have different scenarios. If I over-exaggerated my powers, this can encourage me to go to war even if this was not right. For example, the US in Vietnam War, they over-exaggerated their powers and underestimated their enemy's power. They felt that they are too powerful to go to Vietnam. We can easily go there and we can easily end the operation so quickly, and we can install a friendly regime there. It would not cost us much time or effort. So misperception about your own power and about your enemy's power can lead to a wrong decision. And vice versa, I may underestimate my powers or over-exaggerate my enemy's power. So also this affects my decision to go to war. So to conclude, the second dimension, which is concerned with the leader's choice, here I'm focusing on the personal attributes, characteristics of leaders, their perceptions, and how it affects their decision making. Hope you have understood this part. Please listen carefully to the audio, read carefully the PowerPoint, read carefully your readings, and if you have any inquiry or problem, you can address me through the email, and you can address Dr. Heidi as well. Thank you, and hope to see you soon.